Hello, my name is Josh Stotsky, and this is my PowerPoint presentation and foundational assignment for Honors 233. We were supposed to read one of the three assigned articles, and the one I chose was A Drug Trial Cycle, Recovery, Relapse, and Reinvention. I will basically summarize and analyze the article. So, first of all, the doctor that was emphasized in this reading was named Dr. Keith Flaherty. He, in 2009 in Orlando, Florida, spearheaded an experimental drug trial on melanoma patients. And in front of the world and a bunch of renowned oncologists, he described the success of a drug he was using called PLX4032 in treating melanoma and potentially as a treatment for all cancers. And in his clinical trials, he saw multiple instances of success on his patients when using that drug in melanoma patients. As you can see by the picture, this is Dr. Keith Flaherty. He's a world-renowned oncologist. So now I'm going to get a little into the drug he was using, which was called PLX4032, also known as vemurafenib. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. This drug is used in a process known as targeted therapy, which is considered a much more safe and less harmful process than chemotherapy in treating melanoma. In a clinical trial, oncologists like Flaherty hoped it would work as a safer and more pleasant way to target melanoma, and it did. It functions by prohibiting the proteins in cancer cells that cause the cancer to grow and spread. And then soon after his first clinical trial, and through a bunch of work by him and many other renowned oncologists who were his partners, he was eventually able to work with pharmaceutical companies and get it FDA approved. This is the genetic structure of the protein. Now, upon the use of the drug, there were some problems. First of all, remission did not last very long. Yeah, he did have success in patients in decreasing the melanoma cancer cells and decreasing their growth, but eventually they came back very soon. Melanoma patients who had originally displayed progress, like one of his patients named Mr. Nelson, then began to display symptoms again and eventually died. Flaherty soon determined that the effects of PLX4032 could only last at most 6 months. And this obviously wasn't enough time for people to continue living, nor was it a permanent solution to curing melanoma. If this type of drug were to ever cause a lasting remission, it would have to be combined and be in clinical trials with other drugs in order to create like a final experimental drug to target the cancer cells. And virtually more clinical trials were needed, but as I'm going to mention later, the pharmaceutical companies made that pretty hard. Furthermore, what was so successful about PLX4032 was that it was able to control a mutated gene. But soon after, which is the reason why remission did not last very long, more mutated genes began to control cancer growth, and the cancer continued to grow and grow. So one mutated gene got stopped, but another one took control, and cancer cells started growing. Flaherty and other oncologists believed that this problem could be solved if PLX4032 was combined with other drugs, as I said before. But strict pharmaceutical laws and the expensive clinical trials prevented this. It could cost millions of dollars to get one drug out into the market, for example. Furthermore, pharmaceutical companies would often have to work together with other pharmaceutical companies who are their main competition, obviously, to combine drugs into one clinical trial, and hopefully targets both mutations. And that's virtually impossible with this competition. He thus had to work with pharmaceutical company to quickly complete initial testing and speed up the process of FDA approval. Now, I'm going to talk about one of his patients named Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson was a patient of Dr. Flaherty who experienced an original remission in his late-stage melanoma when taking PLX4032. His cancer was fueled by the mutation BRAF, and PLX4032 was successfully inhibiting it. But eventually, as I said before, the remission did not last, and another mutated gene began to control cancer growth and promote proteins that could like make the cancer growth cells faster. A quote by the National Cancer Institute: "Activating mutations in the BRAF gene are present in a large percentage of human malignant melanomas. Therefore, the BRAF gene had to be stopped, and that's exactly what PLX4032 was doing." According to Flaherty, Nelson's melanoma returned because the BRAF mutation was fueling a different protein than the one targeted by PLX4032. But there was now space for Mr. Nelson in the clinical trial of a drug that could inhibit the second protein with a different company called Glaxo. But if he needed both to combine Roche's PLX4032, that's the pharmaceutical company for PLX4032, and Glaxo's new drug, they would have to work together and clinical trials couldn't be completed, so it wasn't safe to take them together. Here's a picture of Mr. Nelson and Dr. Flaherty checking up on him during one of their many checkups. Now, Dr. Flaherty eventually decided that it would be better for him to leave to work in Massachusetts General Hospital on Harvard's campus, but in doing so, he left many of his patients, including Mr. Nelson, who he deeply cared for. He decided that he would be better off doing research with other oncologists on melanoma in the university setting rather than being a melanoma specialist doctor. And in his final farewell to Mr. Nelson, he was very upset that he was not able to give Mr. Nelson virtually a cure. He didn't have a sure way to give Mr. Nelson treatment and ensure that he would survive and live a longer life. So basically, his advice was not even guaranteed to help them. He made him switch from PLX4032 drug to the other drug, but the time difference between them wouldn't work, and Mr. Nelson would not recover. And yeah, Mr. Nelson needed a combination of drugs, and there was no way to make that happen. He knew that there was not much he could do given the strict and expensive nature of pharmaceutical companies, and he felt he could make more of an impact on the industry and with the pharmaceutical companies at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is pictured right here on Harvard's campus. Now, before I talk more about Dr. Flaherty, I'd like to go into the pharmaceutical company procedure just to show you and emphasize how hard it is for pharmaceutical companies to work together and complete clinical trials. Many cancer specialists believe that a combination of 5 or more drugs are necessary to even cause a temporary remission in cancer. And right now, all they have are clinical trials for one drug at a time, which can take up to 10 years. And due to the nature of pharmaceutical companies, it could take up to 10 years to release a single drug into the market, which would be after the clinical trials. Independent scientists began to request designer knockoff drugs and test them in mice, but human trials can only begin with the help of pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Flaherty thus declared a goal to impact the pharmaceutical market by pressuring the industry. It's small, but over here is a step-by-step list of gaining FDA approval and completing clinical trials and releasing drugs onto the market. And as you can see, it's virtually impossible to do it in a fast period of time, let alone combine drugs and release them together as one drug. Dr. Flaherty knew he had to change something. So here's Flaherty's effort to pressure the industry. After traveling to Massachusetts, Dr. Flaherty decided he needed to change the pharmaceutical industry in order to advance melanoma research, complete clinical trials, and actually help people and make a difference. So he formed a partnership with the world's leading melanoma researchers and oncologists to make it easier and cheaper for pharmaceutical companies to conduct clinical trials on certain drugs. So he decided he had to work with these oncologists to pressure pharmaceutical companies. So he would be participating in many meetings since he was the representative of the entire board of oncologists and melanoma researchers. He met with many pharmaceutical companies in order to strike possible deals and change the industry in order to increase melanoma research. But his plans were futile because the status quo is extremely hard to change. He eventually secured the alliance of a patient advocacy group called the Melanoma Research Foundation. It's another step in the direction of pressuring pharmaceutical companies. And the goals of the Melanoma Research Foundation are spreading awareness and conducting research on melanoma. So that is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, advocacy groups of melanoma. And he had them as a partnership right now, so things were looking good. With the support of many oncologists and melanoma survivors, Flaherty helped organize an extremely important meeting to discuss his PLX 4032 trials. And this meeting was considered one of the most important meetings for melanoma research in history. Despite all of his efforts, Dr. Flaherty was unable to strike a deal with any pharmaceutical companies and bring about change in the industry. When he did meet with a Roche representative, which is a pharmaceutical company, they virtually evaded all of his questions and made it seem like they were going to do something, but Dr. Flaherty knew that his attempt was futile and that there was nothing he could do. Sadly, Mr. Nelson ended up dying after the clinical trials. He died a year after he started Flaherty's drugs and began the Glaxo drugs later. None of it helped. But, as he said, he lived a great life full of gambling and spending time with his family. He was a huge poker player who used to have poker nights, and he traveled to the Bahamas and Atlantis and spent time with his family. So he had a great last year of his life, and his wife said that she really appreciated him and loved the last year they had together. Unfortunately, because it was too late, a drug company called Glaxo decided to begin clinical trials using multiple drugs, which was the company that he was with originally. But Glaxo decided to begin which he was with before, after Roche. But it was too late because the only reason Glaxo did it was because they wanted to take a step up on their competition, which was Roche, and they believed that combining drugs would bring them further results in the competition so they could beat out Roche. But it was too late for him because it takes 10 years to complete a clinical trial, so there was no way he was going to be able to take that drug. But not luckily for him, but a good thing about Dr. Nelson's death and what it symbolized was that it spread more awareness about melanoma, and through the works of Dr. Flaherty, a great deal of progress has been made in melanoma research, just not as much as he had hoped. Not even close, he said. Now, importance to cancer research in people. Despite all of the money being devoted to cancer research through donations, advocacy groups, and other mediums, research and advancements have been extremely slow due to the self-involved and financially motivated practices of pharmaceutical companies. As I said, they focus much more about making money and about their own gains than they do about actually advancing cancer research and helping cancer patients. And it's like that for all industries, not just the melanoma industry. Dr. Flaherty's attempt to pressure the melanoma drug industry is of utmost importance to the entire cancer industry because it may allow for the eventual setting of a precedent or FDA rule that requires pharmaceutical companies to work together rather than to compete to develop cancer drugs. Flaherty wants pharmaceutical companies to start learning that the cancer patient is much more important than their own gains, but it's virtually impossible to tell someone that. But the act of doing it himself could be a start leading in the right direction to a change in the industry. Now, this article is just one example of a group of people who attempt to bring about a difference in the world and in fighting cancer. Hopefully, they can inspire others to do the same. Just like Dr. Flaherty is a melanoma advocate, many people and many writers do the same. They want to reach people and show that there actually is a way to make a difference, that they need to keep on trying to make a difference, because without people like that, pharmaceutical companies will have the entire say on the issue and no difference will be made. And then here's my works cited. Some of the websites I used and articles I explored to do my research included the Amy Harmon drug trial cycle. Was a New York Times article. That's the main article we were supposed to read for this project. A drug trial cycle, recovery, relapse, reinvention. It was published in 2010, so I'm sure a great deal of advancement has been made since then, and Flaherty has continued to work to bring about improvements in the cancer industry and melanoma research. Another source I use was the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the leading research publishers of every type of cancer, not just melanoma. Another one I used was an article on BRAF proteins in cancer, as the article that we had to read for class did not give much detail about the function of the BRAF protein, so I had to expand on it a little and how it advanced cancer cell growth. And the final one I used was the website of the Melanoma Research Foundation just to see what their goals were and how they were supporting cancer. And the chair of that is Steven Silverstein. It was an extremely enlightening project, and I learned much about melanoma and cancer advocates.